She died just after midnight, not from war or wounds, but from the slow forgetfulness of a world that never stopped long enough to remember her. They called her just May. No rank, no title, no backstory worth recording. Just May in 12B, with the oxygen tank and cracked heels, who liked her tea sweet and always stared too long at the sky. When the nurse finally opened the little wooden shadow box tucked above her bed, she expected trinkets, maybe old cards or faded postcards. Instead, she found 3 medals no one on staff could name, a folded flight patch, and a letter sealed in wax, signed by a general whose name still carried weight in the highest corridors of the Pentagon. That's when the director made the call. That's when the flag went up. And that's when someone finally remembered that May Lawson wasn't just another tired widow in hospice care. She had once been a ghost on a runway, a name never typed, a woman who was never supposed to be on board. If you believe no hero should be buried in silence, and that loyalty doesn't end with the war, like and subscribe, because this story deserves to be remembered. It starts long before the medals and long after the battlefields. It starts on a frosted runway in Germany, Ramstein Air Base, 1983. Wind held off the concrete like an angry god. AC-141 transport sat on standby, engines prepped, final manifest checked. On board were 71 passengers, mostly injured servicemen being rotated back to the States, 2 officers, and a loadmaster counting down to takeoff. Everything was green. Everything was standard. Except her. She wasn't on the list. She wasn't wearing a uniform. She stood alone, at the edge of the hangar bay, wrapped in an old bomber jacket 3 sizes too big, her knuckles white around a brown leather satchel. No one knew where she came from. The junior officer at the gate radioed up. "We've got a problem. Civilian. No papers. Says she's waiting on someone." The reply came fast. "No civilians. Manifest final." But the girl didn't leave. Didn't argue. Just stared at the plane like something sacred was slipping through her fingers. Inside the cockpit, Wing Commander Jack Morrell tapped his pen against the dash, waiting for clearance. 20 years flying, 5 theaters, 2 shootouts, and more medals than he kept out. But that morning, something wouldn't sit right. He looked out and saw her, just standing there, frozen but deliberate, like she was holding a line only she could see. And just like that, Morrell pulled off his headset. "Tell Tower we're holding. Door stays open till I say otherwise." Confusion crackled back. "Sir? She's not authorized. We've got orders." Morrell stepped out of the cockpit, down the ramp, through the cold, until he was face to face with the girl. Her cheeks were raw from wind. Her voice barely above a whisper. He said if I ever came, someone would know. She handed him a torn envelope, wax-sealed, edges brittle. Morrell opened it without a word. Inside, 3 lines. "If May ever shows up at Ramstein, you get her home. No questions. You owe me that much, Jack." Signed, Lieutenant Colonel Peter Halvorsen. Morrell froze. The name hit like thunder. Halvorsen had saved his life in Kandahar. Pulled him out with a broken femur and a dozen rounds flying. Halvorsen died 6 weeks later in a failed evac. No body recovered. No ceremony. Just gone. And now, this girl, his daughter, standing in the snow with a letter that had waited 10 years to be opened. Morrell turned on his heel. "Give me the duty officer. She's boarding." The flight crew scrambled. "Sir, she's not cleared." Morrell cut through. "I don't care if she came from Mars. She's on this flight. I'm not lifting off until she's strapped in." For the first time in hours, May exhaled. She didn't cry, didn't smile, just nodded once, like a soldier given orders. As she stepped onto the aircraft, silence rippled through the cabin. Soldiers in slings and braces watched her pass like a rumor come to life. She sat near the rear, bag on her lap, eyes closed. No one asked questions. No one dared. The engines whirred back to life. Manifest was updated by hand. A single name scrawled in ink. Passenger 72, Lawson May. Status, non-military. Priority, absolute. And as the C-141 roared into the sky, leaving Ramstein in a pale blue blur, no one knew the whole story. Not yet. Not how a girl not meant to be there would change the course of a mission. Not how her father's final promise would find its landing decades later. And not how one wing commander's quiet refusal to follow orders blindly would become legend. They only knew this. The plane didn't leave without her. And somewhere, in the folds of that satchel she never let go of, was a story still unfolding. One that would be told not with medals, but with memory. Because some passengers are never listed, but they were always meant to be on board. You could feel it in the cabin. That shift, like the air got heavier the second she stepped on board, and no one knew why. May Lawson, still not saying much, sat in seat 24D with the kind of posture that didn't come from pride, but from knowing you didn't quite belong. The flight crew glanced her way every few minutes, not rudely, just trying to make sense of her. She didn't flinch, didn't fidget, just kept one hand on her satchel, the other gripping the armrest as if the sky might slip away if she let go. It wasn't until they hit cruising altitude, somewhere over the North Atlantic, that Commander Jack Morrell finally unbuckled and made his way down the aisle. He'd stared at that letter for hours now, and it still didn't feel real. Halvorson's handwriting, that old red wax seal he always used, and those damn 7 words that hadn't stopped echoing in his head. "You owe me that much, Jack." He sat across from her, didn't speak right away, just watched her watching the clouds. "You look like him," he said finally. She blinked, but didn't smile. Everyone says that. Then, without being asked, she reached into the satchel and pulled out a second envelope. This one more worn, torn along one edge, and held together by a strip of military duct tape. "He wrote it for you," she said. "Said if something ever happened and I found you, this was yours." Jack took it carefully, hands suddenly not as steady as they used to be. The letter inside wasn't long. It didn't talk about battles or medals, just a few lines about friendship, about debts not paid in medals or promotions, but in blood and silence. And at the bottom, something Jack hadn't expected. "If she finds you, it means I didn't. Make sure she gets there. You know where." And he did. Hill 93, somewhere in rural Virginia, marked only by an old oak tree and a stone with no name. A place only a handful of men remembered, and even fewer ever talked about. It was where Halvorson had once dragged 2 men out of a burning wreck. One of them was Jack. The other died in his arms. There'd never been a funeral. Never a flag. Just that hill, a bottle of bourbon buried beneath the roots, and a promise made in silence. "That's where you're headed?" Jack asked, his voice quieter now. May nodded. "It's the only place he ever talked about." She paused, then added, "And only once." Jack leaned back in his seat, rubbing a hand over his tired face. "He was the best of us," he muttered. "We just never said it out loud." For the rest of the flight, no one disturbed her. When she slept, one of the younger crewmen placed a blanket over her shoulders without waking her. When they landed at Andrews, the base commander was waiting, not with orders, but with silence. Word had already reached the right people. Jack had made sure of it. They arranged a black SUV, quiet escort, and no paperwork. No one even asked for ID. They didn't need to. Halvorson's name was still inked in blood somewhere deep in the defense files. Before she left the tarmac, Jack handed her something. A small metal canister, dented olive green, with 4 initials scratched into the lid PHLH. "We buried this under the tree," he said. He used to say he'd come back for it, but he never did. So maybe it's yours now. May took it with both hands, like it was something sacred. And maybe it was. She didn't cry, didn't even look away, just said, "Thank you, Commander," and stepped into the waiting car. As it pulled away, Jack stood on the edge of the runway, wind tugging at his jacket, 1,000 memories collapsing into the rear window of that SUV. She wasn't supposed to be on that flight. No one knew her name. But somehow, Halvorson had known she'd come, had known someone would have to make the call. And Jack, a man who'd never taken an order without double-checking it, hadn't hesitated. He'd overridden the system, bent protocol, and written her name in permanent ink. Because sometimes, the real orders don't come in an envelope. They come in the moments you can't explain. The face that looks too familiar, the voice that sounds like memory, the letter that's waited 2 decades to be delivered. And somewhere, high above the clouds that day, the Air Force carried a civilian passenger without a uniform, without a rank, but with a mission more important than most of the combat flights Jack had ever flown. And back in the crew log, under mission notes, one crewman scribbled, "Flight completed without incident. Passenger 72 delivered." But that wasn't the whole story. Not even close. Because what May Lawson was carrying wasn't just a letter, or a name, or a memory. It was a final chapter waiting to be closed. And she was headed to the only hill where silence still spoke louder than words. The road to the hill wasn't paved. It was memory-lined and quiet, winding past barns left to the dust and woods thick with years. And when May stepped out of the SUV, the driver didn't follow. He knew better. The hill stood just as her father had described it in that old cassette tape she found years ago, but couldn't bring herself to finish until the night before she boarded the plane. An oak tree crooked like a veteran's back, a stone with no name, and wind that never stopped whispering. The canister Jack gave her was warm in her hands now, even though the air was cold, and she knelt at the roots like someone returning home, not for the first time, but for the first time that mattered. She placed the canister down, pulled the second letter from her coat, and laid it gently beneath the bark. It was addressed not to her, but to the ones who never made it. And though she had never met them, she'd heard their names in the way her father paused between sentences, the way he lit candles for no one on holidays, the way he touched his shoulder at night like he was remembering someone who used to lean on it. She unfolded a simple cloth, an old combat flag, edges tattered but not forgotten, and pinned it to the tree with the last of the brass buttons from his field jacket. No ceremony, no bugles, just a girl, the daughter of a ghost, finishing something that was never meant to be unfinished. And while she stood there in that silence, something happened. One by one, from the tree line, they came. Not press, not brass, but men in old dress uniforms, some walking with canes, others with straight backs and haunted eyes, each holding a memory wrapped in skin. They didn't ask who she was. They already knew. They'd served with her father. Some under him, some beside him. All remembered him. Not just the man who pulled bodies from burning wreckage, but the one who never put his name on the board, who refused a medal for a mission that never officially happened, who carried his pain the way others carried rifles. Always ready, always loaded, never used unless necessary. The eldest among them, a retired chief with 3 stars and a limp that told its own story, saluted her. He told us if a girl ever came, we'd know it was time, he said, voice dry as gravel. Guess it's time. They formed a half circle around the tree, no words, no script, just men holding decades of silence together. And then, at her nod, one of them read the letter aloud. It wasn't long, just a list of names and one sentence. I carried you home, and I'll see you again when someone carries me. When it ended, no one cried, but their eyes were storms. Afterward, they gave her something small, a patch, frayed and faded, from a unit that didn't officially exist. It had been worn by every man in that circle at one point. You're one of us now, one of them said. Not because of blood, but because you showed up. She tucked it into her satchel without a word, knowing some things you don't think, you just carry. The next morning, a folded American flag arrived by courier to Jack Morrell's doorstep, and signed, but bearing a photo of the hill, the tree, and May standing in front of it, the ghost made real. Attached was a note. She delivered him home. He was never on the manifest. But he made it. Jack stood in his doorway, sunlight streaking across the hardwood, and for the first time in years, he let his shoulders drop. Somewhere out there, the war had ended. Not the one with bullets and orders, but the one with memories and guilt. Weeks later, a new plaque was quietly installed at a corner of Arlington, in a shaded path where tourists rarely walked. It didn't bear Halvorson's name. It didn't list May's. It simply read, to the ones who weren't listed, but were always meant to fly. And beneath it, a line carved in deliberate script. She wasn't on the flight manifest, until someone remembered why they fly. The next time Jack flew, a young cadet asked him why seat 24D was always left unassigned on his roster. Jack looked at her, smiled just barely, and said, because some passengers don't need a ticket. They just need someone to hold the door open long enough. And in the years that followed, when recruits asked who May Lawson was, the story would unfold. Not as legend, not as myth, but as a quiet truth passed between those who knew what it meant to wait decades for a name to be remembered. Because sometimes the heroes don't wear tags or carry rifles. Sometimes they carry letters. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do isn't charging into battle. It's standing quietly beside the people who did, long enough to walk them home.